2 weeks ago, I blood tested for the first time in 2025. And note that this is test number 56 since 2015. So with that in mind, what's my biological age? That's what we'll see here. This is using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age clock, PhenoAge. And an important question to ask is, how good is PhenoAge? How good is this biological age clock in terms of its correlation with chronological age and its association with risk of death for all causes? So I posted that video yesterday, and if you missed it, it'll be in the right corner. Also, if you have blood test data and you want to calculate your own biological age using this test, there's a downloadable, free, you don't have to put your email in, link from my website in the video's description. All right, so when entering the biomarker data for these 9 biomarkers, I get a biological age of 32.9 years, which is 19.1 years younger than my chronological. Now note that the theoretical maximum reduction for PhenoAge versus biological age in this case is about 20 years. So this is my second best test over 38 tests over the past 7 years or so. But note that this is just one test, and I see a lot of people online saying my biological age is this or that, and it's only based on one test. I find more value in tracking year-to-year changes with multiple tests each year. For me, I think that's a better representation of tracking and trying to optimize age-related changes. So with that in mind, let's take a look at all data for PhenoAge since 2018, as again, I have 38 blood tests over that span, which is what we'll see here. So in 2018 to 2019, I only had 3 blood tests where I could calculate PhenoAge, and over those 3 tests, average biological age was 36.1 years. But note that 3 tests over a 2-year span probably isn't enough data points to assess year-to-year change. So I started tracking more often. With 6 tests each in 2020 and 2021, so 12 tests total over those 2 years, average biological age was 35.6 in each year. So that's probably a closer representation of my actual biological age in both of those years. And then in 2022, I had my best data yet, and that's now over 7 tests. I started to increase the testing frequency just by a bit to 33.8 years, which got a bit worse in 2023, again over 7 tests, 34.7 years, about the same in 2024, but now over 8 tests. So 34.8 versus 34.7. And now we can put that 32.9, this most recent test 2 weeks ago, into context, as we can see that it's on the right track. Now, if we put all of the data together, we can see that I've avoided an age-related biological age increase. Now, digging deeper, that means that for these 9 biomarkers, I've resisted age-related change, at least going back to 2018, 2019. Now, it's also important to note that even if all biomarkers stay the same using this test, PhenoAge increases by 0.9 years per chronological age for each 1 year that passes for chronological age. So with that in mind, starting in 2020, 0.9 times 4, the 4 years that have passed since then, I should expect to see 35.6 plus 3.6, so 39.2 years for an average value in 2025, not 32.9. So this illustrates that I'm on the right path, that the approach and approaches and correlations and all the things that I'm doing are on the right track. But rather than just entering data into a spreadsheet, let's take a look at the full blood test report, as I do have weak spots in my data. And I think it's important to not just focus on a small subset of biomarkers, which, although they do represent many organ systems in this case, for example, albumin, liver, creatinine, kidney, glucose, metabolic health, inflammation, CRP, and so on. But I think it's important to look at as many biomarkers as possible of as many organ systems as possible, so we leave no stone unturned when trying to slow aging and potentially maximize lifespan. So let's start off with page 1 of 3 of the blood test report. And note that I don't go to my doctor to order these blood tests. I go to ultalabtests.com, where I pick the test exactly that I want. I then bring that to Quest Diagnostics. I pay the $9 blood draw fee, and then I get the majority of these results pretty quickly. So you can see I tested at about 7:30 in the morning, and I had the majority of these results back within 21 hours, which in my opinion is great news. So if you're into blood testing like me and there's a Quest in your area and you want to help support the channel, there's an affiliate link in the video's description. All right, so let's go through the high points and some low points of the blood test data. So first, HDL at 61. That's good news because it's now 14 tests in a row where HDL is greater than or equal to 50, with an average of 56.3 milligrams per deciliter over those 14 tests. Triglycerides at 58 isn't too far from optimal, which is less than 45 in terms of lowest risk of death from coronary heart disease, CHD. LDL at 77 is within the optimal range for lowest risk of death from CHD mortality, which is 65 to 120. And if you're wondering where I'm getting these ranges from, these quote-unquote optimal ranges, I have a new Patreon tier where I summarize all of those data, 40 published papers, in a 95-minute video that lives exclusively and will always live exclusively on Patreon, which includes data for these lipoproteins. That's a small subset of the biomarkers there. All of them are shown here. So if you're interested in what's optimal for biomarkers, check it out. All right, moving down on the list, HSCRP is 0.2 milligrams per liter, and that's now 22 tests in a row where HSCRP is less than the detection limit of 0.3 milligrams per liter or less. But then a potential weak spot, homocysteine at 9.8 micromolar. Sure, it's not higher than the reference range, which you can see is greater than 11 micromolar, but I've had values in the 5 to 6 range about 15 years ago, so it's not a genetic issue. TMG, high dose, 4 grams per day, didn't make a dent. I did that experiment many years ago, and that's on my blog. I've done folate, B6, serine plus B6, B12, methyl B12 does bring it down by about 10%, but going from 11 to 10 isn't a big dent. So for this test, I tried something different, N-acetylcysteine. There are 2 published studies, 2 clinical trials, where N-acetylcysteine at 1.5 grams per day, which is what I supplemented with, reduced homocysteine. But in my case, probably not, as 9.8 is within my usual range without any supplements. So I'm still working on that recipe to try to optimize homocysteine and get it back to where I had it about 15 years ago. All right, on to page 2. Glucose at 84 superficially seems like great news, especially when considering that it increases during aging, and that my 55 test glucose average since 2015 is about 90 milligrams per deciliter. But digging a little deeper, this may not be the good news or great news that I think it is. And that's by looking at HbA1c. Now, 5.4 isn't terribly high, but it's my highest reading since 2015. Now, when considering that I have 55 tests for the majority of blood biomarkers, you might think that I have 55 blood tests for HbA1c, but I don't. I only have 5 tests. So 5.4 is the highest value of 5 tests over the past 10 years. With that in mind, for every test going forward, I'm going to include HbA1c. All right, on to kidney function biomarkers. Creatinine also superficially looks like great news at 0.72. This is my lowest value ever. And it's especially good news when considering my 57 test creatinine average since 2015 is 0.94 milligrams per deciliter. Creatinine levels increase during aging, in part or almost exclusively because of reduced kidney function. So that it's lower than my 57 test average is superficially good news. But the first hint that there may have been some issue with my kidney function, at least moving in the wrong direction. I shouldn't say it's suboptimal or it's terrible, but moving in the wrong direction is blood urea nitrogen. So assuming no increase in protein intake, if BUN increases, that could be because of reduced kidney function as it becomes less efficient at removing urea from the blood. So for my last test, it was 9 milligrams per deciliter. For this test, it was 11 without an increase in protein intake. So that's the first bit, the second sign that there may be some issue with suboptimal or a little bit below my best for kidney function. But more directly, and I can hear some of you screaming out there, measure cystatin C. I did. For the second time. I measured it last year. It was 0.71, so I thought, it's great news. I can just stick to creatinine, BUN, and uric acid. But that 0.71 is not what we see for this test, 0.79. Cystatin C increases during aging, so that 0.79 has gone, or as a part of my normal range, is going in the wrong direction. So with that in mind, I'm going to include also cystatin C for every test going forward. All right, moving on to liver function biomarkers. Albumin at 4.9 is youthful. Alkaline phosphatase is less than 48, which is associated with lowest risk of death for all causes. Similarly, AST and ALT are close to optimal, as both of those liver enzymes follow a J-shaped curve for all-cause mortality risk, with values in the high teens or low 20s associated with lowest risk. So you can see I'm right there for that too. So liver health and function seems to be good news. All right, so then immunoglobulin G. And if you're familiar with the channel, then you saw the presentation by Dr. Li Chang, who reduced IgG and saw an extension in median lifespan. In addition, other interventions that reduce IgG, like calorie restriction, exercise training, and parabiosis, also reduce IgG. So, in my opinion, IgG is an important biomarker to track. I'm going to include it for every blood test going forward. I also have plans to look at biomarker versus biomarker correlations for IgG versus other biomarkers to try to identify where within that normal range may be optimal. IgG levels increase during aging, but there's very little data on all-cause mortality risk. So I'm going to use that biomarker versus biomarker analysis to try to identify within my own data, should it be 1,000, should it be 1,100, how low may be too low and how high may be too high within that reference range. But then potentially the weakest data in my biomarkers are my thyroid hormones. And that shouldn't be a surprise. I was diagnosed as hypothyroid in my 20s. I've been taking levothyroxine, which is T4, from about half my life. So in terms of thyroid function, I'm tracking free T4 and free T3. Free T4 is inactive. Free T3 is active. So I'd want to have a relatively high FT3 to FT4 ratio. In my case, it's relatively low, with a ratio of 0.18. To put that data into context, that's the average value found in 90-year-olds, with values about double that found in youth, 20 to 30 years old. So I'm currently in talks with my primary care doctor, PCP, and the endocrinologist to switch my prescription from T4 to T3. That may be a struggle because when I first moved to Boston 15 years ago, I was on T3 and they basically made me switch to T4 instead of T3. So now I'm going to have to try to convince them to switch me back to T3, which may be a challenge. So stay tuned for that story in upcoming videos. All right, on to page 3. So starting at the top with fibrinogen. Now, this may seem like a random test to add, but when considering when we're looking at what's under the hood, not just focusing on body composition or physical function, when really trying to optimize biomarkers and just specifically blood biomarkers, I think it makes sense to optimize and go after the biggest trees in the forest. So the biggest trees in terms of proteins in blood are albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. So just to put that into perspective, albumin is 5 grams per deciliter. We all talk about and you hear about glucose and say LDL, which could be around 80 milligrams per deciliter. But we've got albumin, which is 5 grams per deciliter, or 5,000 milligrams per deciliter, which is 60 times higher in terms of concentration relative to the things we all talk about, glucose and lipoproteins. Similarly, globulins are the second most abundant protein. Just using IgG as an example, that's 1,000 milligrams per deciliter when compared with the 80 for glucose. Now, fibrinogen is also the third most abundant protein in blood. And you can see in my case, it's on the lower side, which is good news because fibrinogen levels increase during aging. So just for perspective, 258 milligrams per deciliter, that's 3 times higher than glucose or LDL. So I think it makes the most sense to go after the biggest trees in the forest in terms of proteins: albumin, globulin, IgG, and fibrinogen. Now, because fibrinogen is on the lower side, and good news, I'm not going to measure it at every test. So this is a one-off. I'll probably measure it again once next year. And if I see some big deviation, then I'll start to include it for every test going forward. But now some weak spots. White blood cells at 3.4, and it's not a weak spot because the lab flagged it. It's a weak spot because, as shown in that Patreon video, that 95-minute video, white blood cells that are less than 3.5 or 3,500 white blood cells per microliter are associated with a shorter life expectancy relative to 3,500 or 3.5 to 6. Now, that's only one part of the story. We can dig deeper because white blood cells aren't a homogeneous group of cells. They include neutrophils and monocytes, which increase during aging, and lymphocytes, which decline during aging. So let's take a look at those data. So neutrophils at 1727 are a bit low. Values around 2,000 to 3,000 are associated with lowest risk of death for all causes. And also, neutrophils increase during aging. So when considering both of those data, I'd prefer to be around 2,000. But while 1,700 isn't terrible, still around 2,000, I'd be happier if that was the case. Now we can dig a little bit deeper too, because if neutrophils and other white blood cells are low in the context of elevated inflammation, that could suggest some immune deficiency or an inability to make immune cells in the presence of elevated inflammation could be bad news systemically. So for more context, I looked at other pro-inflammatory cytokines besides hsCRP, including interleukin-6, which is important also because it's a senescence-associated secreted protein. So it's produced by senescent cells, which increases during aging. So in my case, 1.4 is below the detection limit, so that's good news. I also measured TNF-alpha, which isn't included on this report. I showed that data on Patreon, but that too is below the detection limit, so that's also good news, and that's also a SASP-secreted protein. So keeping those relatively low, IL-6 and TNF-alpha during aging, is important, especially when considered that senescent cells and these proteins increase during aging. So when considering that neutrophils are a bit on the low side, but inflammation is low, I'm not too worried about neutrophils. On the other hand, lymphocytes now are less than 1550 for the 4th test out of 7 tests. And that's important, or potentially important, because lymphocytes around 2000 is associated with lowest risk of death for all causes, and they decline during aging. So I'm doing something in my approach that's causing them to be more consistently on the lower side relative to the higher side. Now, it's not calorie intake, because calorie intake for this test was almost completely identical to the last test, and I track all of my food with a food scale for those who don't know. I think it was 2119 for the last test and 2120 for this test. And I'll have that diet composition analysis coming in the next video next week. So it's not calorie intake, which is positively correlated with lymphocytes. In other words, a higher calorie intake is positively correlated with higher lymphocytes in my data. So I have other correlations that I'm going after to try to get my lymphocytes more consistently back to 2000 relative to where they were for this test, 1300. All right, red blood cell related measures. And when I mentioned biggest trees in the forest, red blood cells are the most abundant circulating cell type in blood. Now, within red blood cells is hemoglobin, and 14.5 may not superficially seem like bad news, but my 54 test average since 2015 is 15 milligrams per deciliter, or 15 grams per deciliter. So 14.5 is going in the wrong direction, especially when considering it declines during aging. Additionally, 2024's average over 8 tests for hemoglobin was 14.8. So in my opinion, this is how aging starts. It was 15 for a long time, then it's 14.8, 14.5. So I try to get on top of these the biomarkers as soon as possible by following the correlations and bringing it back to 15 if I can, with various interventions by following the correlations as soon as possible, right? Trying to avoid that age-related change by following the data. So going further into red blood cell related measures is the MCV, the mean corpuscular volume, the average volume of red blood cells. So 92.8 is on the higher side of my range. It's not my highest though, but it's also not my lowest. And I'm still not convinced that this isn't a calorie restriction effect. So I've seen a lot of people on CR who have relatively high MCVs, actually much higher than where my data is now. But nonetheless, I've had values that are lower in the high 80s, and that's the target. But potentially the best news in my red blood cell data is the RDW. Not just because it's a major predictor for Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, but if you're familiar with the channel, then you saw Dr. Gary Churchill's presentation on RDW being an important predictor of mouse lifespan, regardless if the mice were eating a regular diet, if they fasted, or they were on calorie restriction. So having a relatively low RDW for as long as possible may be an important pro-longevity strategy. In my case, 11.8 is great news as it increases during aging, and that's on the lower side. All right, 2 more biomarkers to go. DHEA sulfate at 120. Now, I had data in about 15 years ago that were 300. So it's possible that this is an age-related decline. But at that time, I may have been taking DHEA sulfate. I wasn't as rigorous with tracking compared to where I am now. So that could be a supplementation issue or could be an age-related decline. In terms of good news, though, my 19-test DHEA sulfate average since 2022 is 125. So 120 isn't too far from that. Now, I may not be able to get my DHEA sulfate all the way back to 300 without supplementation, but at least avoiding age-related change is the current target, the current goal. And just to add why I'm measuring DHEA sulfate, why specifically this hormone is because androgens as a group decline during aging. My testosterone is generally relatively high, around 900, so I haven't experienced an age-related decline there. Whereas DHEA sulfate, I may have experienced an age-related decline, so I want to keep an eye on that for every test and try to optimize it if I can. When considering that androgens decline as a group, I think it's important to at least include one member of that group as a representative, assuming that DHEA sulfate is representative, so that I don't wake up 40 years from now with all low androgens because I haven't been tracking it over time. And then last but not least, PSA, prostate-specific antigen, as a marker of prostate cancer risk. So relatively lower is better. I've tested it sporadically over the past about 10 years, 5 tests, and 0.28 is on the lower side of that range. So that's good news. I won't be testing that at every test going forward, but probably about once per year. All right, so as I mentioned, what I haven't yet showed is what's the diet and supplement approach that corresponds to this test, this 19-year biological age reduction relative to chronological age. And that'll be in next week's video, a week from today. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon. And before you go, we've got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself while helping to support the channel. And these include ultralabtest.com, which I mentioned already, the clearly filtered water filter, which I use every day. And I should mention all of these affiliates I'm currently using, or have used in the past. At-home metabolomics, oral microbiome composition, NAD testing with Ginfinity, epigenetic testing, at-home blood testing with Cyfox Health, which includes ApoB, but also the DNA methylation test GrimAge, green tea, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, so if you're interested in wearing the ConquerAging or Diet Trying brand, as I've got on here, that link and all of the other links will be in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.